Most people know Christopher Lee for his work in the movies, specifically for his work in The Lord of the Rings, Star Wars, and of course his portrayal of Dracula in 10 films. But he was much more than an actor. He was a man who lived life to the fullest. He was knighted, hunted Nazis in World War II, saved lives, earned several world records, and released several heavy metal albums in the 2000s. And that's just a partial list. Today, we're going to explore the life of Christopher Lee and why he's the most interesting man in the world. But before we get started, subscribe to our channel. Sir Christopher Frank Carandini Lee was born on May 27, 1922 in Belgravia, London, England. Even if he were never to become an actor, his life still would be considered an adventure. It's almost like he'd live the life of Forrest Gump, if Forrest was played by James Bond. We all know Christopher Lee was an actor. What's possibly more interesting is his storied military career. At 18 in 1939, Lee volunteered to fight for the Finnish forces during the Winter War when World War II broke out. By 1941, Lee volunteered for the Royal Air Force, where he felt he could make a greater impact. But after being diagnosed with a damaged optic nerve, he was told he would never be allowed to fly again. So he joined the Royal Air Force Intelligence Branch. It was here that Lee was attached to the Special Operations Executive and the Long Range Desert Group, the precursor of the Special Air Service. Lee never got into the details of his time with the Special Forces, but here's what we know. While in the Special Air Service, he fought in North Africa and then later moved on to Winston Churchill's Special Operations Executive. For his final few months of service, he was seconded to the Central Registry of War Criminals and Security Suspects, where he hunted Nazi criminals throughout Europe. Decades later, when asked about his military service in a press junket, Lee told the interviewer, "Can you keep a secret?" The journalist eagerly said yes. Lee leaned in, lowered his voice, and said, "So can I." When Christopher Lee retired from the military in 1946 at 25, he accomplished all of his previously mentioned military heroics. By the time he was 25, he wasn't sure what he wanted to do with his life. One day, during lunch with his cousin Niccolo Carandini, then the Italian ambassador to Britain, Lee was recounting his time in the military. Carandini then casually suggested, "Why don't you become an actor, Christopher?" And thus began his foray into the pages of the Guinness Book of World Records. In 1948, Lee's first year as an actor, he was in 8 films. By 2007, Guinness World Records honored him with the title of most screen credits held by any living actor, with 244 TV and movie credits under his belt. By the time he passed away on June 7, 2015, he added 24 more credits to that list. Lee got his second world record for being the tallest leading actor, standing at 6'5", which he later went on to share when Vince Vaughn got his SAG card. Christopher Lee was quite the sportsman when he attended Wellington College. He played cricket, rugby, football, and held top ranking in fencing. Christopher Lee's family tree is as impressive as they come. With his pedigree, it's no surprise that he went on to lead an incredibly interesting life. His mother, Countess Estelle Marie, was an Edwardian beauty who was painted by Sir John Lavery, Oswald Burley, Olive Snell, and sculpted by Claire Sheridan. Her lineage can be traced to King Charlemagne. Lee was also a distant relative of a couple of other famous men, American Civil War General Robert E. Lee and English astronomer and mathematician John Lee. And as if his family tree needed to get any cooler, Lee is also a step-cousin of Ian Fleming, the author of the James Bond novels. Lee's mother divorced his father and remarried George Croix Rose, Fleming's uncle. Interestingly enough, Lee would later work with Fleming on the James Bond film, The Man with a Golden Gun, as Francisco Scaramanga, the main villain and assassin, who was identified by his golden gun and superfluous nipple. Fleming originally wanted him to play another Bond role. According to Lee in this interview with Total Film, Fleming wanted his step-cousin to portray a Spectre villain. "He wanted me to play Dr. No, but by the time he got around to remembering to tell the producers, they'd already cast someone else." Spilled milk. And unfortunately, Ian wasn't with us when I did Scaramanga, who is not remotely like the character in the book. In Fleming's novel, he's just a West Indian thug. In the film, he's charming, elegant, amusing, lethal. I played him like the dark side of Bond. It can be said that Christopher Lee had a knack for being at the right place at the right time for most of his life. At 17, during the summer of 1939, Lee was traveling through France to meet up with his sister in the French Riviera when she was on holiday with friends. On his way there, he took a detour through Paris, where he stayed with the journalist Webb Miller. During his stay with Miller, Lee found himself outside the prison walls of Saint-Pierre in Versailles for the public execution of German criminal and serial murderer Eugene Wiedemann. Naturally, because everything in Lee's life was hardcore, Wiedemann's method of execution was by guillotine. The scene was so scandalous and hampered with hysterical behavior by spectators, French President Albert Lebrun immediately banned all future public executions. Witnessing Wiedemann's June 17 execution must have stirred up a dark interest in Lee on the subject matter, because he ended up studying the history of public executions. He also claimed he knew the names of every public executioner in England, dating back to the 15th century. Early into his acting career, Christopher Lee had to make a decision: either continue down the path of his young career as an actor or become an opera singer. Around 1948 or 49, Lee says he was approached by the world-famous tenor Jussi Björling while in Sweden. Björling witnessed Lee casually singing with a bunch of students from Stockholm, walked up to him and told him, "You don't want to waste your time acting. You've got a voice, you have the instrument, you have the sound, you should be a singer." Björling then offered to train Lee, but the actor would have to pay for his own housing and food in Stockholm. Lee was a starving artist and said he had very little money in those days, so he had to turn down the offer, a decision he regretted until his death. When Lee was on military leave in Naples sometime in 1944, he climbed Mount Vesuvius a mere 3 days before it erupted. You could imagine him saying, "Smoke rises from the mountain of doom, Vesuvius. The hour grows late, and Gandalf the Grey rides to Isengard seeking my counsel." The mountain Vesuvius, not doom, erupted on March 17, 1944, about 4 years into World War II. That was the last time the volcano acted up. The 1916 death of Grigory Rasputin, the infamous Russian mystic, is highly contested in some circles. Here's what we know for certain. Rasputin died of 3 gunshots, one of which was at close range to his forehead. Beyond this, little is certain about his death, and the circumstances of his murder have been the subject of considerable speculation. The story goes that he was poisoned, shot, beaten, and then finally drowned. The assassins responsible are thought to be Prince Yusupov and Duke Dmitry Pavlovich. Although Lee starred as Rasputin in Rasputin the Mad Monk, his connection to the assassination goes deeper. Lee actually met Yusupov and Pavlovich as a child due to his mother's royal connections. Christopher Lee was a longtime fan of the Lord of the Rings author J.R.R. Tolkien. As a matter of fact, Lee said he used to read all of Tolkien's books once a year, just because he liked the writing so much. Lee is also the only Lord of the Rings cast member to have ever met the man behind the books. As Lee tells the story, he was out with a group of friends in Oxford sometime in the 50s, and they stopped in the Eagle and Child for a pint. Coincidentally, this happened to be Tolkien's local pub. As we know by now, Christopher Lee had a voice so badass he could have become a legit world-class opera singer in his mid-20s. He chose the path of an actor, but he never let his dream of becoming a singer die, because in 2010, when he was 88 years old, he released his first heavy metal album. The album, his debut, was titled Charlemagne by the Sword and the Cross, and it tells the story of Charlemagne, the first Holy Roman Emperor, his distant relative. In 2013, he released a follow-up album called Charlemagne, Omens of Death, and that was a true heavy metal, nay power metal album. The album's music was arranged by Judas Priest's Richie Faulkner, and at 90 years old, Lee was the oldest heavy metal performer in history. And if you think he got into the world of metal as a lark, you'd be wrong. Lee issued several other legit dark metal releases, including 2014's Metal Night and a couple of dark Christmas EPs, with his metal versions of The Little Drummer Boy and Silent Night. Christopher Lee and Hammer Films go way back. It was with Hammer Films that Lee became something of a household name with his portrayal of Count Dracula in the 1958 classic Dracula. In fact, Lee portrayed several iconic characters from Hammer Films, including The Mummy, Frankenstein's Monster, and Rasputin over 8 of their films. While he has Hammer Films to thank for propelling him from an extra on the bottom of the call sheet to the leading man, Lee wanted to leave the British Film Company. He grew bored with the Dracula character and felt the scripts were weak. Once Hammer's executives found out Lee wanted to move on, they guilted him into staying by explaining how many employees would be out of work if Lee stopped starring in Hammer's films. In short, Lee was emotionally blackmailed into reprising the lead role in Dracula, Prince of Darkness. However, Lee starred in the movie on his terms, and because he felt the script was so bad, Lee refused to utter one line of dialogue. Instead, he hissed and yelled incoherently throughout the film. Christopher Lee played some pretty dark characters in his career as an actor. Dracula, a mummy, Count Dooku, Rasputin, Saruman, even death in a small role. And we know about his work as a black metal singer. So it's no surprise that after decades of making a living surrounding himself with so much sinisterism, people began suspecting Lee was actually a practitioner of the black arts. It was even rumored that Lee owned the largest collection of books on the occult in the entire world. 20,000 books to be exact. By the early 70s, Christopher Lee was Draculaed out. He had played the Count 9 times by 1973, and he wanted to break out of the horror mold he had found himself typecast in. Then Lee met screenwriter Anthony Shaffer. The two hit it off, and they decided to work on a project together, something in the realm of horror, but without the blood or gore. Shaffer came across a novel called Ritual about the sacrificial murder of a local child. Lee and Shaffer paid £15,000 for the rights of the book, and Shaffer wrote the screenplay for what would eventually become The Wicker Man. The only problem was that the film's budget was small, only £500,000. If you're the international man of badassery and darkness, like Christopher Lee, English is definitely not your only language. Lee was fluent in 5 languages: Italian, French, Spanish, German, and obviously mastered English to a Shakespearean degree. He was also proficient in Swedish, Russian, and Greek. Not only did his proficiency in speaking German help him hunt down Nazis during World War II, but it also allowed him to dub the original voice of Thor in the Danish 1986 animated film Valhalla, and of King Haggard in both the English and German versions of the 1982 animated adaptation of The Last Unicorn. Christopher Lee died in a London hospital on June 7, 2015, at the age of 93. His wife of 50 years, the former Danish model Birgit Kronke, was by his side. It said his passing was a peaceful one. We're interested in what you think. Who do you think is the most interesting man in the world and why? So thanks for watching.